Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. I really wanted to talk about Warhammer the Old World lore and how it's progressed since the launch of the game, and I couldn't think of a better person to join me than my good friend Jordan from the Jordan Sorcery YouTube channel.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Counter-Attack Bases. They stock a wide range of counters, gaming aids and movement trays for multiple game systems and offer custom items to suit your club, your event or even your podcast or YouTube channel. Check out the link in the video description.
Thank you for joining me, Jordan. You are absolutely the best person to come and talk about Warhammer lore that I can think of. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to get into this because I think there's been a lot of really fun stuff for the old world. So unpacking it a little bit feels like a good time to be doing it as well.
Yeah, it feels like we're finally getting to a stage where there's enough to kind of review it, start reflecting upon what we already have and where it might go in the future, rather than a lot of hopes of where it's going to be. We know it's well on its path. It's closer to 2 years now than it is to one from its release. So it's a good time. So I suppose the questions we're going to try and answer today is how is it building as a setting for our war games, and we'll also see for a role play game as well. And then, is it going to provide what we need as an intriguing setting for our war games? Has it got enough growth for future narratives, and what's missing if there is anything missing? And also without, I suppose, it infringing too much on what comes afterwards in timeline, but without messing up previous lore and making nerds very angry on the internet, which is usually the way if it does. So let's start off, I suppose. We had the initial release, and we have the lore that's provided in the core rulebook and the two armies books, Ravening Hordes and the Forces of Fantasy. And you get the usual big rulebook, sort of background history lore, which hasn't changed really from the initial games of Fantasy, which was nice. And then you've got a lore that stops earlier than it would normally if you're a fan of Fantasy. And then that's backed up by individual faction in those two army books as well. What did you think coming away from reading that way back probably 18 months or so ago now?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, you say it didn't change much, but I think there's an interesting kind of little sub-question within that, or a little discussion to have before having any sort of getting any further into it. And that's the really interesting place that the old world as a game has to sit. So you've had 8 previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and the End Times, if you want to count that as almost like a separate sub-story thing. And now you've got Age of Sigmar, which itself has had 4 editions. So there's loads and loads of lore out there that ostensibly is connected. Now, the reality is that a lot of those editions of Warhammer were reboots, right? It's not a continuing story. Every time a new edition comes out, they change some stuff. They revise other things. Some stuff disappears. New things are added to make room for new releases, new armies, new units, new characters. So all of that sort of stuff has been happening for the entire history of Warhammer, and continues to this day. So when you're creating the old world, or when they were creating the old world, yes, technically they're saying, right, this is a prequel. And it's not just a prequel to 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, it's also a prequel to Age of Sigmar. So they're kind of, they've got 2 things they're tying it to start with. And then they're also looking back at all of that Warhammer history, it feels like, and saying, well, let's take some of the coolest stuff from this as well. And Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as well, lest we forget, right? So there's loads of material that they're then distilling down into like a new flavor of Warhammer. So I think the old world, whilst, yes, it's technically, it's the same world, it is continuing the sort of broader stories and themes of Warhammer Fantasy, especially from the 8th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. It's also this new kind of thing. It's a loosely put, it's a reboot, right? It's almost an impossible task to take all of that stuff and turn it into something cohesive. I think they do a really good job with that, though, right? And I think that those core 3 books manage to satisfy a lot of those demands quite well. There's a lot of stuff that is like quite epic kind of ties, I think, to Age of Sigmar. Maybe even a little bit more than I personally would need. Like, there's a lot of stuff that sort of draws on, this sort of it kind of has this feeling of myth and legend and the world
Hmm.
that was kind of talk, and there's also they're drawing on a lot of the Black Library stuff with the Time of Legends novel series, which mostly didn't exist for many editions of Warhammer Fantasy. So you get the sort of background to the Warhammer world as discussed in the old world just has so much more
Hmm.
about what happened thousands and thousands of years ago. So there's loads of
Yes.
this really epic stuff with like the end of the world before things have even begun. The end of the world, chaos have overrun it. Great elven gods fighting against this chaos and all this sort of stuff. That's really interesting and a sort of a kind of it's quite cool and quite visual in a way. But for me, it's when we move beyond that into and then the Warhammer world started.
Yes.
So I don't really need all those chapters in quite as much detail. But they sort of they kind of create the bedrock from which you then create what we would sort of more familiarly call the old world. And all of that
Yes.
sort of stuff does a really nice job of like getting us to this place to the 2300 roughly of here's all the factions in the old world, here's what they're all up to, and here's a load of new things that we weren't familiar with before that are the current concerns for people. And I think that's all really cool.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe should have put it in the intro. If you are coming to this and you're a fantasy fan of old, the old world has got a completely different setting in terms of time. It's the late 2200 rather than the 2500s in terms of timeline. So while it looks and feels like 8th edition fantasy because so much of it is the same miniatures and aesthetics and even artwork in many ways,
Mm.
it is from a time period a couple of hundred years beforehand. And I agree with you. There is an expansion of that earlier history in many ways. It's very much written, even though it's an earlier period, it's written with all the knowledge from all the other editions and all the other things placed upon it. And maybe that's needed in some ways to fill out, and I don't mean in a bad way, negative way, fill, but to give more detail because they had a similar kind of page count that you had for previous editions, but you have less factions to talk about because not all the existing factions are covered in the same detail. There are legacy factions out there. So there were spaces that would have been taken up by pages on Skaven, pages on ogres and things which just aren't included in this cool rule book as well. And maybe there's a little bit more detail about areas that aren't always covered because we get some stuff around the Border Princes and some stuff around Talir and Estalia, which a lot of people I think skimmed over. I know mentioned it in a lot of my videos, but I think a lot of people skimmed over at the beginning because they weren't listed in the 9 factions. But if you pay attention to those, there's no surprising when we see little nods to them in arcane journals as they come out, and there may be clues there for what's coming in the future. I don't know for sure. For me, at the end of it, I thought it was nicely written. It worked really well, and we've got this kind of, but it is very much here we are at this point in history. It didn't necessarily feel any different. So aesthetically, if you're imagining the world, it feels like it's the same. But I was left really waiting for more. I want to find more about this timeline, and watching the way people react online to lore. There's a lot of people that just, you can see they're totally in that 8th edition era mindset still with fantasy. They just see it as that world still as a new set of rules with less factions. But the lore, the new storyline, the new narrative, the new setting hasn't really embedded itself yet. I think we're starting to see the change with that now, but that's jumping ahead a little bit. But it was pretty vague. And I didn't feel I learned too much new about that other than where those main factions were at that given point in 2276. Empire maybe filled out a little bit more, but again, that's just a split empire politically. But all the other factions are, dwarves are dwarves in many ways and what they're doing, and elves are elves, very similar no matter where they are in in a lot of their timelines. So the next stage then was our first arcane journals. First 9, we can include Cathay in that first run because they've become a main faction. And I don't know what you've felt about those as they come out. Did they add much to the history from your point of view?
Yeah, massively, yeah. I think they're actually really nice. I think as a way of sort of building out the factions, telling more of their story, and just in terms of like actual products, I think they're just a really nice, well polished release. And I think there's a like a really because it's a light touch kind of lore and a light touch kind of way of expanding on the factions and telling a bit more of their story. We're not talking about fourth edition armies books here, which are just like huge tomes compared to these. These are quite small and sort of discrete little pockets of lore. You get a number of pages and then you get into the armies and stuff, but they're done in a really nice way that is, again, there's a lot of business considerations when they're sort of putting all this sort of stuff together. And I feel like maybe just because I'm older, I appreciate and understand a lot more of that side of things. When I was younger, when this stuff was coming out 20 years ago, it was just a new thing that came out that was cool. And you didn't really have to think about, oh, well, this is trying to achieve this, that, and the other, because they've got these new models and they've got this new range and this is sort of happening. So maybe a bit more cognizant of that kind of stuff now.
Yeah.
But even being aware of all of that, knowing, okay, well, they're going to have to make space for Cathay because that's going to be a new range that comes out. Or we're not going to have access to these miniatures because they are in a different game system or they're no longer being produced. So all of these like business realities have been factored in a way that feels quite nice and organic, that kind of tells an interesting little story, that positions the factions in a really cool way. And there's also some nice world building through like the scenarios as well. So having every single book start from like a broad, here's what the Wood Elves are about right now.
Yeah.
And then we're going to move into a narrative focused on one general, one character, and we're going to then lead from that narrative about what they're specifically up to into an actual battle scenario that features them. I think that's a really nice way of doing it because it personalizes it. It makes you go from the broad strokes that you're seeing in the core books to something more directly applicable to the army that you're about to collect. And then right down to the battle you're about to fight. And I think that's a really nice way of sort of making you a part of the story as well. Yeah, format-wise, I think it's great. And then the actual stories themselves, I think they've chosen really well to actually make them all into, they are, there's a sense of the world at stake, but we know it's not really because we know there's another 200 years to go. So they've made it into personal stories. They've made it built around specific characters, specific campaigns and quests and whatever else, so that there are stakes for those armies without it being the entire world's going to end if they lose this battle sort of thing.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, without getting into rules side of things, and definitely in terms of the balance of them, I think there's a really nice blend and mix and balance within those books between the rules, which special character wise are very much linked to the narratives that's told, and I like the way it grows from a briefer history through to the beginning of what they're doing now and how that campaign builds into the narrative battle that's each one of those. The balance of that, it works really, really nicely. And it starts to kind of give you layers of what each of these armies, these factions are doing within the old world of this timeline. So I think they land that very well within the 48 pages that they have, because it is limited. I think one of the things I noticed earlier on it's kind of a negative, but I don't know what else they would do from the business things we've already talked about, is you're missing something. So every previous edition of where an army book existed, you'd have the lore in the core rulebook, tick, we've got that. Then you'd have the faction lore in the core rulebook, tick, we've got that, and that's kind of repeated in the army books. And then you've got your codex or your army book for fantasy, and you've got loads of history, and you've got that big history repeated. There's not pages for that for the old world. If you're coming to the old world having played other fantasy editions, maybe own other army books, that's not a problem because you know it all. You know about this faction. But if you're coming brand new to square-based fantasy for the old world, you're missing an awful lot because of that naturally shortened pre-history that you've got in an arcane journal. So what is 6 pages was 30 pages in a full book. Not every book is as bad as others with that, because different factions have different layers. So the polar ends of those would be High Elves is very light because they have such a big, vast history that was set out, you probably agree, in the 4th edition army book. Yeah. Whereas something like Beasts of Chaos, it feels like you've got the whole story in there because it's much more compact. There's less kind of dates and times and this famous person and this ruler and that. So maybe it's not as important, But it does feel, as someone new coming to the game, if they really, really want to know more, you'd almost need to send them to an edition of a book that doesn't exist for this game in order to get that knowledge. So I think it's a shame, but I also don't know what they could do other than bring out bigger army books. And I quite like this format.
I mean, I'd always take a bigger army book. If they were like, okay, we're going to do 100-page arcane journals instead, and we're going to put a load of those maps and timelines and geographical histories and all that sort of stuff in there, that would be awesome. I'd be in favor of it. But yeah, it's a fair point because a lot of that stuff already exists and is broadly applicable to the old world as a setting. The geography is roughly the same. So do you need to have like a load of stuff about the rivers in the Empire again? Probably not. But yeah, I think it's a fair point. I would love to see more material always for this kind of stuff. But even like the actual armies, the idea of creating armies of infamy, because you don't need to buy the arcane journals at all, right? Because if you've got Forces of Fantasy or Ravening Hordes, you've got your army list. So there has to be something appealing in the book that's like brand new, and they've done that through the Armies of Infamy, which is itself a good chance to do more world building and to sort of expand. Okay, well, here's a characterful army list, and why it's important and who was fighting in it, and like a bit more information about them as well. So I think that it's been successful in that way. But yeah, there's definitely more opportunity to continue to sort of explore the. So I think the broader setting is a really interesting choice. So the what was it, 2276, right? So the way in which the Empire is split, the relationships between the dwarves and the elves and the humans of that time, there's a lot of opportunity, and the position that Chaos are in right now, to like explore in more detail what that really means. And again, there's some realities here that you can't avoid. Like the Empire army miniatures are the same miniatures that existed for 8th edition. You're not going to get 4 different Empire armies with complete different miniature ranges. Sadly, I think there is, though, the potential to explore in more detail what that actually looks like. So just saying this is the time of 3 emperors or 4 emperors, and things are divided and split, and there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. You're telling, not showing a little bit. And I think that's an area where, certainly in the role-playing games, but also in future arcane journals, I think there's a huge opportunity to really get down into the weeds of that and explore that in more detail, because it has to be different. It is different to Sigmar's Empire of 8th edition and all the other Warhammer Fantasy Battle editions. But what does that look like on the ground, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and the pictures of the miniatures would tell you it doesn't look any different. So the only way you can do that really is just lean into that, the fact that it is very much the same and it is politically, and that's probably what they've decided upon. But it's not been described maybe in so much in that way. The miniatures visually tell that story for you. Those pictures show you what it is, and reusing some of the artwork. So it's a business decision that's probably been forced upon them about how many new miniatures they can bring out. But there's room for expanding narratively about why it looks the same and why technology is slow. And it's always been that way, I suppose. We've looked at those vast timelines of history and about this battle and that battle, and I don't know about you, I've always pictured it in my head very much in a similar kind of aesthetics as you kind of know that the origins, legends, stories of Sigmar, that was more primitive because it's described that way in the story, but there were never any miniatures to go with that anyway. But it feels like once they got to that developed stage, then everything's kind of maintained itself.
I think there are battle reports in White Dwarf that will be like, this is 200 or 300 or 400 years ago, and it's exactly the same army.
Exactly the same.
That's fighting today. Grom the Paunch, I think, invaded Ulthuan hundreds of years before the main setting, but is using exactly the same goblin armies as you would in a contemporary battle. That's totally fine. I mean, I've got no problem with that. Similarly, I've got no problem with accepting that the old world as a game setting is its own thing in a lot of ways. It's drawing on loads of cool stuff, and actually that is something I really like about the Arcane Journals and the core books. there's been a real effort, you can tell there's been a real effort to go like, what are some cool stuff? Like, what can we name check? What can we reference? Where can we draw inspiration from? Like, there's just lots of cool things from previous ranges and previous
Yeah.
books. Clearly fan favorites, but also the writers' favorites, I'm guessing, where they've just got, oh, I love that unit, so I'm going to mention
Yeah.
them. And
Manan's
I think that's
blades.
great. Yeah, Manan's blades been,
Causes
stuff
trouble
like
though,
that.
because
Great.
everyone including myself, wants to know now why they've not brought them back.
Yeah, and it could just literally be because it's fun to reference. Like
Fun to bring,
it's
yeah, and I think
yeah,
that's probably
it's great.
what it is.
Yeah, and if it turns out to be some subtle clue or whatever, that's cool as well. But even just purely in terms of like world building for this version of the setting, I think it's fun. So I'm on board with that.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like now we're emerging into a second stage of Arcane Journal. So we just had Dawn of the Storm Dragon, which was the first well, you could argue the first Cathay Arcane Journal was slightly different as well because they didn't have a Grand Army list. But if we ignore that slight thing, because that's more to do with rules and how they are delivered to us than the actual lore. The new Arcane Journal that we've just had, Dawn of the Storm Dragon, and then we've got one coming soon, the War of Cetra's Fury, feel like we're entering a second stage of Arcane Journals where they're not about delivering just an expansion to the 9 factions, or original 9 factions, and their armies, 2 armies of me each. They all had a very solid format. These seem to be a little bit more narrative driven, and they're a little bit more inconsistent in terms of what you might expect inside. So there's 1 army of infamy in Dawn of the Storm Dragon. I think they said there's 3 coming with the Cetra's Fury, and they're focusing on different areas. Now, each of the Arcane Journals we had before, some of them would almost pair up, that the narrative story that was told would overlap with another one. So the Empire book would talk about fighting Beastmen, and the Beastmen book would talk about emerging war with those, but then also the Wood Elves, and then the Wood Elf book talked about fighting Beastmen as well, and those narrative stories. And it felt like they were sort of building a platform, and then this is now turning those campaigns up. Not quite to 11 yet, but we're kind of edging up to some what feels more like a big events might be happening, and the stories are being told in these. Whereas the original Arcane Journals, at least to me, felt like we're giving you some ideas of the kind of conflicts that are happening at this time. Well, now it's like this war in Westerland that Cathay have had to come over and help the Empire with. It's a big chaos invasion. This is a big story, a big narrative journey of this time, and I've got a feeling that the War of Cetra's Fury will do something similar in the Border Princes area with Cetra, obviously, and all the things they're adding there. So I don't know about you, it feels like these are pushing that narrative up, what I've been hoping for, I suppose.
Yeah, I like it. I think it's a nice way to do it because you've got. I think it's quite interesting when you look at the Storm Dragon book, is how much more it puts an emphasis onto chaos. So it felt like chaos they were certainly not played down, but we know from the broader history of the Warhammer world that chaos, okay, they're going to be a problem for the Great War, which is coming up in within a decade, but they're going to be defeated, and then it's going to be 200 years before the real like mega chaos invasion happens. It felt like it was a ways off. In the Storm Dragon book, it really feels like they're emphasizing, okay, so we told you about Friedel Chainmaker. She's actually the real deal. She's something to be afraid of. So much so that the Cathayans have decided, okay, well, we need to step in because the elves are not doing anything, the dwarves are not doing anything, the Empire can't solve the problem on its own. Similarly, the references to like Crawlmore and the Beastmen and the war that they've been waging on the Wood Elves, it really positions the Wood Elves of having a rough time. So you kind of, it leans in more than ever to, okay, actually things are a bit rough, actually. This is, what was a period of relative peace and relative sort of, prosperity, even with the divisions within the Empire and other factors as well. They weren't under direct threat, but now with this book, they're kind of saying, oh, actually, things are a bit worse than maybe you thought they were. And there's a real impending storm now.
Yeah, I'd agree. It feels like, and I don't think we're going to see this anytime soon, with the Great War against Chaos. I think that's something that they'll naturally want to keep way back, because that almost messes the setting they're creating. But it feels like, you're not just sitting around twiddling your thumbs in a time of relative peace before that arrives. Actually, wars tend to slowly bubble up and build up, and this is a real big invasion that needs to be dealt with before that happens, and probably the outcomes and effects of that will have ripples and maybe causes towards what happens in 20 odd years on from that narrative point in the book. So that's really good, and it feels like it needs something big. But it's also, I personally, I think they seem to have got the balance quite right, where it's still limited to certain areas. So there are bits that are a little bit more peaceful in the way that we've felt, and there's a little bit of an overlap here with the way the old world roleplay game, which we'll talk about last in more detail, but the setting around that is that the normal people aren't quite as aware of chaos. They're aware of beastmen, but normal life is more about the things that are happening within their towns. Every cult isn't a chaos cult. It hasn't quite saturated itself in the underworld of society the way it does in the fantasy that we knew before. And this is kind of pushing back on that a little bit, but without wrecking it, I think. But there's a tight balance there, because it's saying that chaos is having an impact, but it's a military impact rather than that kind of societal impact. So that's why both those things can work. But it is a balance, because otherwise there's almost two versions of the Empire being told in terms of a narrative.
Sure. But I think the thing with that is that chaos at this time feels like it's an external thing. So if you lived in the Empire, you could relatively confidently be sort of saying, okay, well, chaos, yeah, sure, it's a thing. I've heard about it, but it's a thing that's happening far away on the coast. Yeah. And also, it's a thing that's brought to us. It's something that from the external world is sort of brought into the Empire. I think following the Great War, and by the time you get to the classic editions of Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, by that time, chaos is a thing that exists very much within the Empire. It's been corrupted from within pretty much top to bottom. And, any chance to save it, any chance that it was kind of that it would be the noble enterprise one might have argued it was at some point, is kind of lost. There's too many branches of chaos and corruption just at every strata of society in the 2500s. Chaos, as we know, they technically do win. Maybe they already had won because they'd so thoroughly undermined the Empire by the time of the end times. Obviously, that's speculative, but I think there's enough space to have those different perspectives on what's happening at this point in time in the Empire, and for them not to tread on each other's toes. And one of the reasons that's possible is because of sort of canny planning, I think, where the big focus for Friedal is the wasteland, is Westerland. It is an area that hasn't been explored all that much in any previous Warhammer edition, or even in the role-playing game. Yes, sure, there are scenarios and things that do happen around there, but it's not a majorly trafficked area. Marienburg absolutely is, but some of those areas around it are kind of open ground for fresh storytelling, and that's what they're doing. They're saying, well, they're
preamble to a discussion about Marienburg, usually, aren't they? They're not
right, exactly, yeah. Or where you go and then come back to, you go off and do an adventure and come back into Marienburg, and that's where the real narrative heft takes place. So being able to sort of go, okay, well, here's a load of towns in that place that have fallen to the Chainmaker, and here's what's going to happen next, and we're going to have some major battles there. It is fertile, ironically, given it's all gross bogs and marshes, it's fertile ground for this kind of campaign storytelling.
Yeah, I think so as well. I suppose what helps and lends into that balance being right is that we're talking about marauding warriors here, very much tribe-based in terms of the majority, still Chaos Warriors as well, and no demons as yet, or very few demonic things, and that kind of aligns with that. The fact that the gods have not got themselves into the machinations of the center of government in the Empire at this stage, and that kind of all works. And how much of that is planned? We'll assume that is all planned of how they've balanced this setting. And for me, I think it feels maybe it's because I think about it a lot, and I know you think about it as well, but it feels that is where the current setting is starting to find itself as something that's different. But it'd be really interesting to know whether other players still just picture this game in their heads as the 2500s fantasy. I'm so wrapped up in it. I don't know. I'm starting to see it as this, regardless of what the miniatures look like on the table, I'm starting to see this kind of new version of the Empire, but it is very Empire centric. I think let's explore the role play game a little bit more, as we've touched on it then, and we'll end with novels and or maybe lack of them. So we've both read the all of the publications so far. You've been involved actually in writing a little bit as well for the Games Master's Guide for the role play game. So it'd be really interesting to get your perspective on how those publications and what Cubicle 7 are doing are aligning with what's going on with what the main studio are doing with their narratives, because as we've said, it's the same timeline, some of the same geographic areas, but slightly different stories being told. And do they contradict each other, or are they working quite nicely together?
Yeah, and obviously, there's purely my perspective on it, and that is one who's had a tiny involvement in any of that work, but I think it's a really nice balance. So the way in which the role-playing game is set up is that you can position it anywhere, you can set it anywhere in the old world that you want, but the area that's been chosen as the sort of default, the starter place, is a town called Talagad in Talabheim, or near Talabheim, and that is not an area that's had a lot of material in the past. It's deep within the Empire, but it's close enough to, if you want to go up to Kislev and be close to what's going to happen when you get to a Great War, you can. It is in the Great Forest. There's a lot of opportunity for storytelling there. So there's loads of really interesting avenues to explore that haven't been explored in a lot of detail before, either in the miniatures games or in the role-playing games. There are supplements and stuff that have been set in that area, but not very many, and they're not extensive. So again, it's kind of in the same way as putting Friedal into Westerland. By putting the role-playing game into this place, you've got a lot of opportunity to tell new stories and to build the world, certainly not from scratch, but a new perspective on a world that's always been there, but you just hadn't been able to see it before. And I think that's quite nice, because then that also means that you're not as likely to contradict anything else.
Yeah.
And the geographic distance between where the role-playing game is sort of focusing on and where the miniatures game is focusing on, even though they can overlap, there's enough narrative distance between the two for you to be able to do lots of cool stuff in both without treading on toes, which I think is really nice.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're totally right. It's for those who haven't read the books, there's some lovely kind of building there, but it's obviously very Empire focused. I know a lot of the comments I had on the review videos I did was, what's going on with this faction, what's going on? But this is a new game that's, I suppose the way they do it, it's soft launch, isn't it? You pre-order now and you get your digital versions, but you've not got your hardback books and things yet, and we've not got supplements yet, and there's not even a starter set released yet. I believe that's on the way soon. So we did these early stages, but we are starting from the Empire, and no doubt it will spread out a little bit. So there's not an awful lot sort of brand new lore there that's telling you something new, informing you of facts and figures and dates and all those kind of things. But what there is a greater understanding. A lot of this is my interpretation from reading, a greater understanding of what's going on in the Empire with normal people and how it feels. And if you view your Warhammer the way quite a lot of people do, and definitely I do, through an Empire-centric, and it's always been fairly Empire-centric, of what the politics of the Empire and how they interact with the rest of the world, then I think that's really good. I think it just gives you a little bit more of an idea of the way the world works. And that might not be through reading 20 pages of this plot, this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. But it might be from just reading character descriptions, NPC descriptions, learning what a brewmaster is and what they're doing. You just start to build a bit more of a depth of what's going on in the world, a bit more of understanding how life is, and that should help you. Especially in the absence of, at the moment, much fiction set in that area. And if you a fan of that kind of understanding of the world, then I really recommend going to pick up those books and reading them just for that reason alone, rather than the rules. Because
Yeah,
just reading those entries and those the flavor bits around the locations and around the different NPCs and characters and classes of people, you get a really good idea about what everyone's doing. Are there halflings in the Empire? Are there dwarves in the Empire? Yes, there are. There are all those things that you kind of would hope would be there, are there, and you just get a bit of an understanding of it. So I think he's doing a very good job doing that. But I'm really looking forward to proper expansions and campaigns, because we will learn more and more about more individual places then, and I think on stories and the kind of things that are going on. And I think that will you'll begin to see some interplay with what's going on with those bigger warlike story arcs that are happening from the main side.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, when you look back to Warhammer's development, a lot of what we would recognize as being like the default Warhammer world came from the third edition of the game.
Yeah,
But actually, a lot of what's in the third edition of the game came from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay's first edition.
indeed. Yeah,
None of it was created in a vacuum at all. But like that first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and its campaign, The Enemy Within, did so much work to create the Empire and to center the Empire as the sort of main faction and the main geographical area, the old world itself, and to explore a lot of that, to ground everything else, so that you were then able to sort of start to understand the contrasts between, okay, well, if the Empire is like this, how does that relate to what the dwarfs are? How does that relate to what the elves are? How does that relate to what the Bretonians are? So it kind of gave you a really interesting way into the world. We always, I think this is true of a lot of different stories. People like to sort of have a way in, an audience surrogate who they can then sort of enter the world through, and through their eyes start to understand it. In the case of Warhammer, that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes has been the Empire, and that, with good reason, it works. It's so grounded in human history and it's so relatable in so many ways. It then allows you to start absorbing the fantasy that exists within the Empire itself, and then move out into the sort of wider world. So I think, in the same way as those role-playing games and supplements did such a huge job to build out the world and deepen it for the third edition and beyond, you'd like to think that the old world RPG has a load of opportunity to sort of deepen the world as we're seeing it beyond the table, the miniatures tabletop battle game. Because you're never going to get in the miniature game, you're never going to have like brewmasters, dwarves who are responsible for ensuring there's peace between humans and dwarfs in the ale houses and taverns, right? Because that doesn't really fit in any sort of tabletop capacity. Maybe it'll turn up in a bit of lore for a Joseph Bugman style character or something, but you're not going to explore that in too much detail. You're not going to get like crime kingpin halflings and sort of explore those guys, or whatever else it might be. But there is an opportunity to have them in the role-playing game, and to then use them to further deepen and expand the story of everything else, which will make its way back into the miniatures game. So much influence from the RPG found its way onto the tabletop because people love that particular setting, or part of the setting, or army, or character, or what have you. So I think being able, the fact that there is a game that exists that's set in the old world on the role playing side, that will allow an opportunity to drill into that, and to, like you say, I would love for there to be more like expansions beyond the old world. Obviously, there's loads of material already around Talagad specifically and Talabheim. I think there's loads of opportunity for more stuff across the Empire as well. But going beyond that, if you do go out into the Border Princes and do some stuff there, that would be really cool. If you're going out further beyond and looking at other parts of the world as the world is growing, we've just had Cathay arrive in the old world. What a major event in terms of like the narrative impact of that. I think, it's been 20 plus years since we've seen a new faction in the Warhammer setting, certainly on this kind of scale. Again, a very tough job to integrate that into a load of existing lore, a load of existing expectations, and all that sort of stuff. I think they've done a really good job with that and establishing what Cathay is and why they are in the old world at all, and sort of where they fit into that broader narrative. I think all of that's really cool. I do hope that there is the opportunity to sort of progress their narrative, and also, the door is open there, presumably, to like explore why Cathay are not around in the old world by 2500,
Yeah,
2525 or
hope
whenever.
so.
You would, if I would love to see, because they're positioned as being a very strong faction, right, which makes a lot of sense. If you're going
Yeah,
to send your best troops and all that sort of stuff to the old world to help out against something you see as a major threat, you would expect them to be really strong and powerful, and to establish a beachhead, and for there to be loads of playable armies for them. So that all it makes a lot of sense, and the way that's done is perfectly good. They
yeah,
are they are like very good at a lot of things in the lore, in the narrative, in the story.
yeah.
Grand Cathay is like the best at making cannons, the best at training soldiers, the best at using this kind of magic or what have you, or gunpowder weapons they invented before the dwarves, and all this sort of stuff. So you've kind of positioned them as at the forefront of a lot of different elements of the wider lore. And again, you're trying to establish a new faction. They need to be important. You're going to want them to be
Hmm.
good at some stuff. But I think that this allows for a really interesting narrative, and this is pure, what I would love to see. But I think if
Yeah,
you were to then have that they are revealed to be a bit arrogant, they are themselves, even though they're looking down their noses at the high elves for being arrogant. They're also a bit arrogant. They think we can sort this out. We can save the day. We're the best at all of this stuff. Maybe that's a bit of pride before the fall, and maybe whatever they get up to in the old world, sure, it might save a few people and do some good at this point in time, but one would assume it is not a long-standing success, because otherwise, why are they not around by the time of the end times? I know
yeah.
Cathay is, but in Cathay, why is there no Cathayan army in the old world at that point in time? Do they just win, pack up their bags, and leave? That's probably not, for me, the most satisfying story. Maybe they lose ultimately, and that could be a
Mm.
really interesting story.
There's loads of room for that, uh, and because we don't, I mean, this is where they may have to change certain stories or expand upon when they decide whether to go near the Great War against Chaos or not, because it may well be that this is just designed to butt against it and never quite get to
Sure.
that. Or it's penciled in. How do we relaunch this game on its fifth edition or something, and call it that, and then move the time forward, which is an option as well. But at that point, they're either going to be involved and probably be destroyed or diminished in a way that's why they're not in the later stories, or they don't get that far for
Mm.
whatever reason, because they're diminished or something happens. And there's loads of room for developing other sides of the story. It's definitely back in Cathay. We only know really about one dragon a lot. Another dragon's mentioned in terms of as a regent. And sending the one dragon Miao Ying that we've got in this storyline. There's narrative reasons why we've got a limited roster in the game that work quite well, because they've only sent their most elite troops. I'm sure some of that's got to do with what they're available to produce as a miniatures company as
Sure.
well at this time, because the Total War game has a vast range of other troops, which we might see in the future. So there's already things built in there, but it's definitely enough at the moment. It's just very subtle about maybe there will be a darker side or something that's not quite as good that might go wrong, or political problems. So there's room there for all of that as well.
Yeah.
And my hope is that they do explore that, because it would make it an even more interesting and deeper faction. Maybe they return after one of this campaign and find out that in their absence that some political machinations have been going on and the region has
Yeah,
changed
sure.
or something.
Yeah.
There's so much room for that, and maybe they've got that. So it's exciting that we can talk about that, because like you were right now they do seem very, very good, but that fits what they need to be doing right now in that elite sense. But hopefully they don't stick that as the pure narrative, so we know that strength. Hopefully we'll see some of the potential wins
Yeah, I
they
think
have as well.
it wouldn't feel as satisfying, I don't think, if in 5 years' time, the old world as a game has continued to evolve and change. If in the narrative Cathay is still talked about in exactly this same way. I
Yeah,
think establishing them right now, absolutely fine. I think it does a lot of good work. I think, though, you do want to see the shine come off a little bit less polish maybe, and that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go full grimdark and full everyone's betrayed everyone and it's all gone wrong, but you do want to see like maybe a bit more depth, should we say, like a little bit, like it allows for more interesting stories, whether
Yeah.
that comes from arrogance or corruption or just making mistakes, whatever it is. There's lots of different routes to maybe take that shine off a little bit and to maybe get them a bit more involved with the other factions. This will
Yeah.
be really interesting, I think, to see in how they interact with, so Empress Margarita of Marienburg has teamed up with the Storm Dragon. What's that relationship look like? How
Yeah.
does that play out? What do their armies do together? Because if Cathay is just amazing in the narrative, why do they even need the Empire to be with them at all? So there's a lot
Yeah.
of, there's interesting stories to tell that explore that relationship. We've seen in every army book for every edition of the game stories of mistakes that happened, generals who overstretched or went the wrong way or made the wrong call, and that has made those narratives stronger and those factions stronger. Let's see some of that. I think will be really, the opportunity exists now for it because they're into the action now. We've had the setup, we've established them. We're now into the campaign. The Storm Dragon is marching into the wastes to fight against chaos. Let's see let's see how that plays out and where things maybe don't work out quite perfectly.
Yeah, exactly. I think that almost ties us nicely over to stories being maybe what we need more of. We have one novel so far, and there's a review on your channel. We both spoke to Graham and Neil. I'll try to remember to pop a link in for that. I enjoyed it, but I want a lot more. There are elements in it that not everyone likes as well, and that's fair enough. There's some reasonable arguments about certain law things that maybe should or should be different. But aside from that, that's not what we're here to sort of talk about so much here today. That gave us a lovely beginning story focused around the Bretonnians and the Tomb Kings. But we've already talked about all these other different elements. I feel that some of the depth we are calling out for is best told in a novel. It's a little bit. I find it a little bit baffling at the moment that we've not had a second novel. I would have genuinely put money. I don't bet, but I would have genuinely put money on the second book being with the Cathay launch. And I was wrong that there isn't one, and it doesn't look like anything's coming soon because the novels that we do know are coming back because Amazon gives everything away, are rebranded old world existing stories. So,
Yes.
do you have any thoughts about novels and what's needed there?
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm also very surprised that we didn't see a Cathay novel because that does feel like the perfect narrative. So, like, if you just had I know it tells these stories within the arcane journals that have been released, but you could have had a couple of characters who were on the Storm Dragon's ship and
Yeah.
tell a story of their journey over, or their first encounters with Friedal, or even before. You could end the novel with, and now you've been recruited to go on this quest to the old world. So there's definitely the opportunity to establish other characters, which also I think would be really beneficial, because one of the dangers I think with Cathay, and I know there's a lot of lore from the Total War game, but one of the dangers with Cathay more broadly is their characters all just being the dragons. And if you focus all of their sort of character-based narrative and plot just around these 7 or 8 or 9 generals and like leaders,
Demigods, really, aren't they?
yeah, demigods,
They're like Horus
magic
Heresy
dragons.
Primarchs, really.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You don't want the story of this entire faction to only be from its gods, because that's not only less interesting, but also gives you so much less room to like maneuver. Like
Yeah.
if we only know what the Storm Dragon is up to, and we never get any of her like her leadership team or any of her soldiers, none of her generals, none of her champions. Like if not, there's no other characters for us to like get to know and sort of support and want to see what they're up to. It's kind of similar to like, again, it's the audience surrogate. It's hard for us, I would imagine. For me, I speak for myself only. It's hard for me to find a dragon empress who is like an ageless sorceress being Like it's not that relatable. So if that's the only narrative that you're going to have for the
You're
entire
saying it
campaign,
is a little bit relatable.
it's a little bit, it's a little bit. Uh, but if it's and that's not to say you need to relate to every single character, but
Yeah,
I think it is better to get different perspectives from within that camp. Again,
yeah,
a real opportunity to share a little bit more about how Cathay works and what their, maybe some of their flaws would be to get the perspective of a foot soldier or a general who disagrees with the Storm Dragon. What happens then? What happens if the Storm Dragon's best general says, "I think we should go that way"? Actually, how does she deal with that? Is she magnanimous? Does she accept counsel? Does she override him or her? Like what does that look like? Because that's going to tell us a lot more about their real character.
yes,
So
yeah.
I think, yeah, and it doesn't, and Cathay is just a good example of where a fictional novel would be great. I would love short stories and novels scattered around the old world as a setting because it's a rich world. It is different to Eighth Edition and everything that came before it. So there is the opportunity to tell some really interesting new stories with new characters during this time. So I'd love to see it, and I think if you look again to Age of Sigmar, one of the ways in which that setting got established and has become what it is today is through the fiction that was added
Yeah.
to it that helped to flesh it out and really drive its narratives forward. That doesn't mean you need to have like an epic series of novels and the story has to progress according to those novels, but having some stories, some books and short stories that do go, okay, well, what's it like in Marienburg during this time period? Is it the same? And if it's not, how does it differ? What's it like over
Yeah,
here? What's it like over there? Like all of those kinds of stories can be really, really cool, and just
yeah.
they help you fall in love with a setting more. So yeah, I would love to see some more. I very much hope there is some planned. But yeah, it is interesting to me that we haven't seen anything else since Lords of the Lords. Which was what I mean. Is that 18 months
Launch.
old now?
It was,
Right.
yeah, it was launch time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Uh, I agree completely. I don't think you need in many ways. You don't need to mess with the current timeline that the studio are doing in terms of big events. You have stories that work within those that don't go beyond what's told in the arcane journals, and it just gives you the opportunity to almost expand upon the characters, give those characters some life beyond a profile and a short bit of writing around who they are, and bring those special characters to be names that people talk about beyond their whether they're OP on the tabletop or not. And I think that'll probably naturally happen. It has in previous editions, but it is very strange that there's been such a gap.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think it must speak to the wow, this is done so much better than we thought of. I'm sure someone's been hired now and is maybe writing already, but it does show that at the point of launch, all the things that were planned, which would have been all the books we've had now, probably at least the first up to Cathay. There wasn't another novel planned in at all at that
Yeah.
stage.
It's interesting.
It's really
It's
interesting.
especially interesting because we know Games Workshop and Black Library know how to do this really well. I mean,
Mm,
again, you look at 40k and Age of Sigmar, how many really cool characters have been created for Black Library novels that then become like much loved characters who get miniatures and then you want to be following their adventures in the miniature game, in the war game. Like it helps you understand so much more about like how does the Imperial Guard function? What are the Space Marines actually really like? What happens in the Mortal Realms when it's not a big battle? All of that kind of stuff is really helped by having these cool stories and cool characters. So yeah, fingers
great.
crossed. You're totally right. For all we know, next week they announce a load of novels. They've been lining them up for 18 months. I imagine it takes a long time to write a novel. So
Yeah,
how cool would it
yeah.
be if, yeah, they suddenly announce there's a load of new stories, it's
That's a
kicking off.
series.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed, because I think that's probably everything else seems to be moving in a really positive direction. For me, that feels like the icing on the top that will, or the cake that will really bring a little bit of that together. But thank you very much for spending the time to me today to talking about this. I knew you'd be the best person to get on board and talk about the law. But thank you very much for chatting.
Oh, thank you for having me, Stu. It's been great to chat.
Well, thank you very much to Jordan for joining me for this chat, and I really, really hope you've enjoyed watching it as well, and really love to hear in the comments what you think about the law and how it's developed and what you'd like to see in the future. I imagine there'll be plenty of comments about more novels, and I know a lot of you are excited about what's going on in the role-play game as well. But what would you like to see from the main studio games workshop, in the expansion and the Arcane journals? Put that all below. I really, really love to get involved in those comments and find out what you're all excited to see. If you have enjoyed the video, please do give it a like as well, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. If you really, really want to support me, please do check out my Patreon. It really genuinely helps me out, and thank you to all my existing patrons for all the support that you give me. Please also check out the channel sponsor, Counterattack Bases. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.